Welcome to the Rainy Night Storyteller, where shadows whisper and the rain tells tales of the unknown. Tonight, we'll step into the chilling realm of the unexplained, where every creak, every shadow, and every whisper could mean something more sinister. From haunted houses to mysterious strangers, these spine-tingling stories are sure to keep you on edge. So, grab your blanket, dim the lights, and let the rain guide us through these eerie encounters. The chill wind whipped through the gaps in the ancient trees, sending shivers down my spine that had nothing to do with the October air. Chris, my ever-optimistic hiking buddy, seemed oblivious, his grin as wide as the mountain vista spread out before us. This is it, man. The heart of the Appalachians. Primeval. Untouched. He gestured with a sweep of his arm that took in the rolling hills, fading into a hazy blue distance. I had to admit, the view was breathtaking. The vibrant colors of fall painted the slopes in fiery hues of crimson and gold, the sunlight filtering through the leaves like stained glass. But there was an undeniable eeriness to the place too, a sense of ancient secrets whispering on the wind. Maybe it was the way the gnarled branches of the trees seemed to claw at the sky, or the unnatural stillness that hung in the air, broken only by the rustling of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. Whatever it was, a prickle of unease settled in my gut, a feeling I couldn't shake off. "Let's set up camp before it gets dark," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Chris, already rummaging through his backpack, just nodded in agreement. We'd chosen a small clearing nestled among the trees, a hidden pocket of relative flat ground sheltered from the wind. As we worked, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched and contorted like phantoms. The temperature plummeted, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me, the sudden cold seeping into my bones. With the tent pitched and a fire crackling merrily in the growing darkness, a semblance of normality returned. We cooked our simple meal of sausages and beans, the familiar smells a comforting anchor in this unfamiliar environment. "Remember that time we camped by the lake, and that raccoon tried to steal your entire bag of marshmallows?" Chris chuckled, his eyes twinkling in the firelight. I laughed, the memory momentarily erasing the unease that had been gnawing at me. How could I forget? Little Bandit almost got away with it too. We fell into our usual rhythm of shared stories and comfortable silences, the firelight casting a warm glow on our faces. But as the night deepened, and the forest around us fell silent, that unsettling feeling crept back in. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of fear through me. I found myself constantly scanning the darkness beyond the firelight, searching for the source of the unsettling noises. "Everything all right, man?" Chris asked, noticing my unease. "Yeah, fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just a bit spooked, I guess. Never been this deep in the woods before." He clapped me on the shoulder, his easy confidence doing little to calm my nerves. "Don't worry, I've got your back. Nothing's gonna get us out here." Famous last words, I thought grimly. As the hours ticked by, the fire dwindled, and the forest grew darker and more menacing. I tried to relax, to tell myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the feeling of being watched intensified. I could almost feel eyes on me, piercing the darkness, observing my every move. Then came the singing. It started as a low, mournful hum, barely audible above the crackling of the dying embers. At first, I thought it was the wind whistling through the trees, but the sound grew steadily louder, taking on a distinct melody, haunting and strangely beautiful. Chris heard it too. He sat up, his face pale in the flickering firelight. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice laced with fear. I shook my head, unable to speak. The singing continued, growing louder, closer, weaving its way into our campsite, a chilling counterpoint to the chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. And then, through the gaps in the trees, I saw them. Figures, tall, slender, their bodies swaying in time with the music. They were too far away to make out any details, but their presence was undeniable, their movements unnerving. They seemed to glide through the undergrowth, their feet barely disturbing the leaves on the forest floor. Panic clawed at my throat. "We need to get out of here," I hissed, scrambling to my feet. Chris, equally terrified, nodded his agreement. We hastily doused the fire, plunging ourselves into near darkness, and crept towards the edge of the clearing, our hearts pounding in our chests. But it was too late. The figures were closer now, their singing louder, their movements more frantic. They were circling us, closing in, their shadowy forms barely visible in the darkness. I grabbed Chris's hand, and we ran. We scrambled through the undergrowth, branches whipping at our faces, thorns tearing at our clothes. The singing followed us, relentless, growing louder with every step. We stumbled and fell, our breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked back, and through the trees, I saw them. They were closer than ever, their eyes glowing in the darkness, their mouths open in a silent scream. We had to get out of the woods. We had to get away. We burst out of the trees, gasping for air, our legs burning, the singing fading slightly behind us. We didn't stop running until we reached the dirt road, the faint glow of the moon our only guide. Collapsing onto the rough gravel, we lay there for what felt like an eternity, our chests heaving, our minds reeling. Finally, when I could speak again, I croaked, "What the hell were those things?" Chris, his face ashen in the moonlight, shook his head. "I don't know, man. I've never seen anything like that." We sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the forest, the normal night noises now amplified, every rustle and chirp sending shivers down our spines. The singing had stopped, but the feeling of being watched lingered, a heavy presence in the darkness. "We can't stay here," I said, pushing myself to my feet. "We need to get to the car." Chris nodded, and we started walking, our pace slow and cautious. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the moon our only companion. Every shadow, every bend in the road, filled us with dread, but we pressed on, driven by the primal need to escape the forest and its unseen inhabitants. It was almost dawn when we finally reached the car, its familiar shape a welcome sight in the growing light. We piled in, our bodies aching, our minds exhausted. As I turned the key in the ignition, I glanced back at the forest, its dark silhouette looming against the brightening sky. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the eyes of the singers were still on us, following our every move. The drive back to civilization was a blur of exhaustion and fear. We didn't speak, the silence filled with unspoken questions and the lingering echo of the haunting melody. As we reached the outskirts of town, the first rays of the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden light on the familiar streets. It felt like we were emerging from a nightmare, stepping back into the safety of the real world. We parted ways with a brief, awkward hug, the unspoken agreement that we wouldn't discuss the events of the night hanging heavy in the air. I drove home in a daze, the events of the night replaying in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that I had been marked by the experience. Back in the familiar comfort of my apartment, I tried to convince myself that it was all a bad dream, a figment of my overactive imagination. But the fear lingered, a cold knot in my stomach. I showered, trying to wash away the lingering feeling of dread, but it clung to me like a second skin. As I lay in bed, the exhaustion finally catching up with me, I heard it again. The singing, faint at first, then growing louder, weaving its way into my dreams. I saw the figures again, their eyes glowing in the darkness, their mouths open in a silent scream. I woke with a gasp, bathed in sweat, the echo of the singing still ringing in my ears. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, my mind racing. I had to get out of the apartment. I had to get away from the memories, from the fear. I threw on some clothes and stumbled out into the pre-dawn light. The city was still asleep, the streets deserted. I walked aimlessly, trying to clear my head, to shake off the lingering sense of dread. As I passed a shop window, I caught sight of my reflection, and that's when I saw it. There, on my arm, a faint mark, almost like a bruise, in the shape of a handprint. I stared at it in horror, the chilling realization dawning on me. The nightmare was real. The singers had touched me. They had left their mark. The mark pulsed with a faint, eerie light, like a dying ember. I touched it tentatively, a jolt of icy fear shooting through me. It was cold, unnaturally so, and it seemed to thrum with a strange energy. I tried to wash it off, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if it had become a part of me, a permanent reminder of my encounter with the singers. Panic set in. I didn't know what to do, who to turn to. The doctors would think I was crazy. The police would dismiss it as a prank. I was alone with this, alone with the mark, alone with the fear. The days that followed were a blur of paranoia and dread. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't concentrate. The mark on my arm was a constant presence, a chilling reminder of the night in the woods. I felt like I was being watched, followed, hunted. Every shadow, every creak in the floorboards sent my heart racing. The singing haunted my waking hours, a constant whisper in the back of my mind. I saw the figures everywhere, in the faces of strangers, in the shadows of the city. They were closing in. I knew it. They were coming for me. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag, threw some essentials together, and fled the city. I drove for hours, the road stretching out before me like an escape route. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get away, had to put as much distance between myself and the singers as possible. I ended up in a small town, miles from anywhere, a place where the shadows seemed less menacing, the silence less oppressive. I rented a room in a dingy motel, the anonymity a welcome relief. I tried to build a new life, to forget the horrors of the past, but the mark remained, a constant reminder of my ordeal. And then, one night, it started again. The singing. It was faint at first, a distant whisper on the wind, but it grew steadily louder, closer, until it filled my room, filled my head, filled my entire being. I cowered under the covers, my hands over my ears, but I couldn't shut it out. It was everywhere, inescapable. The figures appeared in the room, their eyes glowing in the darkness, their mouths open in a silent scream. They reached for me, their hands outstretched, their touch icy cold. I screamed, but no sound came out. I tried to fight, but I was paralyzed with fear. They were closing in, their faces inches from mine, their breath hot on my skin. And then, everything went black. I woke up in a hospital bed, the sterile smell of disinfectant filling my nostrils. A doctor was standing over me, his face etched with concern. "You're lucky to be alive," he said. "You were found unconscious in your motel room. You've been in a coma for weeks." I tried to speak, but my voice was raspy and weak. "The singers," I croaked. "They were here." The doctor frowned. "There was no one else in the room," he said. "You were alone." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "No, they were here. I saw them. They touched me." The doctor patted my hand reassuringly. "It's okay," he said. "You're safe now. Just try to rest." But I knew I wasn't safe. I would never be safe. The singers had marked me, and they would never let me go. I spent weeks in the hospital, recovering from my ordeal. The doctors ran tests, but they couldn't find anything wrong with me. They diagnosed me with post-traumatic stress disorder and prescribed medication. But the pills couldn't erase the memories, couldn't silence the singing, couldn't remove the mark. I left the hospital a changed man. The world seemed different, darker, more menacing. I saw the singers everywhere, in the shadows, in the crowds, in my dreams. I was a prisoner of my own fear, trapped in a nightmare that refused to end. I tried to go back to my old life, but it was impossible. I couldn't hold down a job, couldn't maintain relationships. I was a shell of my former self, haunted by the memories of that night in the woods. One day, I found myself back in the mountains. I don't know what drew me there, but I felt an irresistible pull. a need to confront my fears, to face the singers. I hiked deep into the woods, following the same path I had taken that fateful night. The forest seemed different now, darker, more sinister. The trees loomed over me, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to grab me. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps. I reached the clearing where we had camped. The fire pit was still there, the ashes cold and lifeless. I stood there for a long time, remembering the events of that night, the singing, the figures, the fear. And then I heard it again, the singing. It was faint at first, but it grew steadily louder, closer. I turned and saw them, emerging from the trees, their eyes glowing in the darkness, their mouths open in a silent scream. They were coming for me. I knew there was no escape. This was it, the end. I closed my eyes and waited. The rhythmic clatter of my keyboard filled the small bedroom, the glow of the monitor reflecting in my wide eyes. It was a Friday night, and I was completely engrossed in the latest horror game, the adrenaline pumping through my veins with every jump scare and unsettling sound effect. Rain lashed against the windows of my cozy apartment, the wind howling a mournful tune that seeped through the cracks in the old building. Suddenly, a sharp knock echoed through the apartment, startling me. I paused the game, the eerie silence of the virtual world replaced by the insistent rapping at my front door. Who could that be at this hour? A shiver ran down my spine, an unwelcome prickle of unease settling in my stomach. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the storm outside only amplified the sense of isolation. Hesitantly, I rose from my chair and padded across the worn carpet to the front door. Peeking through the peephole, I was met with darkness. Frowning, I cautiously unlocked the door and pulled it open a crack, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No answer, only the sound of the wind and rain. I pushed the door open wider, peering out into the dimly lit hallway. There was no one there. Strange. Maybe it was just some kids playing a prank. Closing the door with a sigh, I returned to my game, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that lingered. But the moment I sat back down, another knock rattled the door, louder this time. Annoyance mixed with the fear creeping up my throat. This was getting ridiculous. With a surge of irritation, I swung the door open, ready to give whoever it was a piece of my mind. But the words died in my throat. Standing in the doorway was an elderly woman, her face etched with wrinkles, her eyes glinting unnaturally in the dim light. She was dressed in a long, faded coat, her gray hair escaping from a loose bun, and a strange, unsettling smile played on her lips. "Can I help you?" I managed to stammer, my voice barely a whisper. The woman's smile widened, revealing a set of yellowed teeth. "Dear, I seem to be lost. Could you perhaps?" Her voice trailed off, a low, raspy sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Help me?" Something about her felt off, a sense of wrongness that set my alarm bells ringing. My instinct screamed at me to slam the door shut. "I'm sorry," I said, forcing a smile. "I can't help you. Maybe you should try calling someone?" The woman's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing. "That's very rude of you, young lady," she hissed, her voice laced with an unexpected venom. "Very rude indeed." Before she could say another word, I slammed the door shut, the lock clicking reassuringly into place. My heart hammered against my ribs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Who was that woman, and what did she want? Leaning against the door, I tried to calm my racing heart. The old woman's words echoed in my mind, very rude indeed. What a strange encounter. Maybe she was just senile, or perhaps under the influence of something. Whatever the reason, I was glad she was gone. Trying to distract myself, I went back to my game, but the unsettling feeling persisted. I couldn't shake off the image of the woman's eerie smile and those piercing eyes. The wind continued to howl outside, and every creak and groan of the old building sent shivers down my spine. Suddenly, a loud scraping sound pierced through the storm's fury, coming from my bedroom window. I froze, my blood turning to ice. My bedroom was on the second floor. How could anyone be at my window? With trembling legs, I crept towards the window, my heart pounding in my ears. As I cautiously peered through the blinds, a wave of terror washed over me. The old woman was there, her face pressed against the glass, her eyes burning with malevolent intensity. She was holding a knife, its blade glinting menacingly in the moonlight. I gasped, stumbling back from the window. The old woman rapped on the glass with the handle of the knife, her smile wider and more sinister than before. Panic surged through me, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. This was a nightmare. I scrambled back to my bed, diving under the covers, pulling the blankets over my head. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the terrifying image of the old woman at my window. My body trembled uncontrollably, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The scraping at the window continued, followed by the sound of tapping, like the old woman was trying to pry the window open. Then, silence. I held my breath, listening intently, fear gnawing at my insides. Had she gone? A few moments later, the doorbell rang, a long, insistent peal that echoed through the apartment. I flinched, my heart leaping into my throat. It rang again, and then again, each ring sending a fresh wave of terror through me. I didn't dare move. I couldn't bring myself to even peek out from under the covers. Whoever was at the door, it had to be the old woman, and she clearly wasn't going to give up. The doorbell continued to ring intermittently, the sound a constant reminder of the danger lurking outside. I lay huddled under the blankets, my mind racing, my body paralyzed with fear. I was trapped, alone in my own apartment, with a seemingly deranged woman trying to get in. Time lost all meaning as I lay there, curled up in a ball, every nerve on high alert. The sporadic ringing of the doorbell eventually stopped, but the silence that followed was just as unsettling. I was afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid of what might be waiting for me on the other side of the door. Exhaustion eventually crept in, and I drifted in and out of a fitful sleep, plagued by nightmares of the old woman's leering face and the glint of the knife. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, sent a jolt of fear through me, snapping me awake. The first rays of dawn filtering through the blinds finally brought a sense of relief, chasing away the shadows and the terrors of the night. With the arrival of daylight, the fear that had held me captive began to recede, replaced by a sense of disbelief and a lingering unease. Cautiously, I crawled out of bed, my body stiff and sore. I tiptoed to the window and peered out cautiously. The street below was deserted, the only sign of the storm the puddles glistening on the sidewalk. There was no trace of the old woman. Taking a deep breath, I went to the front door, my hand hovering over the handle. I hesitated, remembering the relentless ringing of the doorbell. What if she was still out there, waiting? With a surge of determination, I flung the door open. The hallway was empty. I stepped out, scanning the area, but there was no sign of the old woman. Relief washed over me, mixed with a lingering sense of dread. I quickly called my dad, recounting the terrifying events of the night. He listened patiently, his voice filled with concern. "You did the right thing, sweetheart," he said reassuringly. "Never open the door to strangers, especially at night. It sounds like you had a lucky escape." His words brought a measure of comfort, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. Who was that woman? Why was she so insistent on getting into my apartment? And what was with the knife? The questions lingered in my mind, casting a shadow over the day. The experience had shaken me to my core, leaving me with a profound sense of vulnerability. I was no longer comfortable in my own home, every creak and groan of the old building a reminder of the terror I had experienced. The rain was coming down in sheets, blurring the already indistinct edges of the highway. It was well past midnight. The kind of hour where even the most hardened truckers start to feel a prickle of unease. I was no exception. My eyelids were heavy. The monotony of the endless asphalt ribbon and the rhythmic swoosh of the wipers lulling me into a state of near hypnosis. I'd been driving for hours, ever since leaving that godforsaken conference in Cleveland, and all I wanted was to get home to my wife and the warm embrace of my bed. The highway cut through a desolate stretch of countryside, miles and miles of dense woodland pressing close on either side, their silhouettes like gnarled claws against the storm-tossed sky. Every few miles, a dilapidated signpost would flash by, its faded paint barely visible in the gloom, announcing some long-forgotten town or rest stop. But there were no lights, no signs of life, just the endless, rain-soaked road and the oppressive silence of the night. I was starting to regret not stopping at that last motel, the one with the flickering neon sign and the unsettlingly quiet parking lot. But I'd been so focused on getting home, on putting as much distance as possible between myself and that dreadful conference, that I hadn't wanted to waste any time. Now, I was paying the price. Suddenly, through the veil of rain, I saw a figure standing by the roadside. A woman, her form slender and indistinct in the downpour. She was waving, a desperate, frantic gesture that cut through the lethargy that had settled over me. My first instinct was to keep driving. It was late, the area was isolated, and something about the situation just felt off. But then I saw her face, pale and drawn in the fleeting light of my headlights, and a pang of sympathy shot through me. She looked terrified. I slowed the car, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. Was this a trap? Was it safe? But the image of her face, etched with fear, wouldn't leave my mind. With a sigh of resignation, I pulled over to the shoulder, the tires crunching on the gravel. Need a lift? I called out, rolling down the window a crack. The rain lashed in, instantly chilling the interior of the car. The woman nodded eagerly, her voice barely a whisper above the wind. "Please," she said, "I need to get to the hospital. My water just broke." A wave of concern washed over me. This wasn't some random hitchhiker. This was a woman in distress. "Get in," I said, unlocking the passenger door. She slid into the passenger seat, bringing with her a gust of cold, damp air and a faint, unfamiliar perfume. I caught a glimpse of her face in the dim light of the dashboard, young, maybe early 20s, with wide, anxious eyes. Her dark hair was plastered to her forehead, her clothes soaked through. Thank you so much," she said, her voice trembling. I didn't know what I was going to do. "Don't worry," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "We'll get you to the hospital in no time. Which one are you headed to?" She gave me the name of a hospital, one I vaguely recognized as being in the next town over. I pulled back onto the highway, the tires spitting up plumes of water as I accelerated. As we drove, I tried to make small talk, to ease the tension that seemed to crackle in the air. But the woman's responses were short, almost monosyllabic. She kept her gaze fixed on her lap, her hands clasped tightly together. Every now and then, she would let out a sharp, shallow breath, like someone trying to suppress a sob. The rain continued to fall relentlessly, the windshield wipers working overtime to maintain some semblance of visibility. The highway was deserted, not a single other vehicle in sight. The only sounds were the drumming of the rain on the roof of the car and the low hum of the engine. I stole a glance at my passenger. Something about her demeanor was starting to unsettle me. It wasn't just her nervousness, it was something more, intangible. Her eyes, when they occasionally met mine in the rearview mirror, seemed to hold a strange intensity, a flicker of something that sent a shiver down my spine. And then there were the things she said, disjointed phrases, whispered under her breath, that seemed to have no connection to the conversation. "They're coming," she'd murmur, or "he won't let me go." I tried to ignore it, to chalk it up to the stress of the situation. But a growing sense of unease was taking root in my gut. I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. Suddenly, The woman let out a gasp, her body tensing. "Stop the car," she said, her voice sharp and urgent. I frowned. "What? Why?" "Just stop the car," she repeated, her eyes wide with panic. I hesitated, unsure of what to do, but there was a note of hysteria in her voice that I couldn't ignore. Reluctantly, I pulled over to the side of the road, my heart pounding in my chest. The car screeched to a halt, the tires skidding slightly on the wet asphalt. "What is it?" I asked, my voice tight with apprehension. "What's wrong?" The woman was staring straight ahead, her eyes wide and unblinking. "He's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's coming for me." I followed her gaze, but saw nothing but the impenetrable darkness beyond the windshield. "Who's here?" I asked, my unease growing. "Who's coming for you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned towards me, her eyes burning with an unnatural intensity. "You have to help me," she pleaded. "You have to protect me." "From what?" I asked, my voice trembling. A low growl, almost imperceptible, seemed to emanate from her throat. Her features contorted, her skin taking on a sickly, grayish hue. The faint perfume she wore intensified, becoming cloying, almost suffocating. Suddenly, a wave of icy cold swept through the car, raising goosebumps on my arms. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I felt a presence, something malevolent, something unholy. Terror gripped me, a primal fear that sent my heart racing. "Get out," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "Get out of the car." The woman's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a snarl. "No," she hissed, her voice raspy and inhuman. "You can't leave me. You have to help me. Get out," I shouted, my fear giving way to anger. "Get out now." She lunged at me, her fingers outstretched like claws. I recoiled, instinctively throwing my arm up to protect myself, but she didn't touch me. Instead, she let out a piercing shriek, a sound that seemed to claw at my eardrums. Driven by sheer panic, I fumbled for the gear stick, threw the car into drive, and slammed my foot on the accelerator. The car lurched forward, tires screeching in protest. I didn't look back, didn't dare to see what was happening in the back seat. All I wanted was to get away, to escape the horror that had invaded my car. The highway stretched out before me, a ribbon of black snaking through the torrential rain. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. The speedometer needle crept higher and higher, but I didn't dare slow down. I could still hear her screams echoing in my ears, her chilling laughter swirling around me like a malevolent wind. Every shadow, every flicker of movement in the periphery of my vision sent a jolt of fear through me. Was she still in the car? Had she somehow managed to cling on? I glanced nervously in the rearview mirror, but saw nothing but the empty back seat, the rain-streaked window reflecting my own terrified face. But the feeling of dread persisted, a cold weight settling in my stomach. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched, that something evil was lurking just beyond my perception. The miles flew by in a blur of fear and adrenaline. I didn't stop, didn't even slow down. The need to escape, to put as much distance as possible between myself and that horrifying encounter, consumed me. Finally, through the rain-lashed windshield, I saw the lights of a town. Relief washed over me, a wave of gratitude for the sight of civilization. I drove straight to the nearest gas station, its fluorescent lights a beacon of safety in the oppressive darkness. I pulled up to the pumps, my hands shaking as I turned off the engine. The silence that descended was almost deafening, broken only by the drumming of the rain on the car roof. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath, trying to calm my racing heart. Then, with trembling hands, I reached for my phone and dialed 911. "Hello?" A woman's voice answered. "What's your emergency?" I need help," I stammered, my voice thick with emotion. I think I just encountered something. I recounted the events of the past hour, the hitchhiker, the hospital, the terrifying transformation, the escape. The operator listened patiently, her voice calm and reassuring. "Sir," she said when I had finished, "can you tell me your location?" I gave her the name of the gas station. "Okay, sir," she said. "Stay where you are. We're sending someone out to you right now." I hung up, feeling a surge of relief. Help was on its way. I wasn't alone. The police arrived within minutes, 2 officers in a patrol car, their faces grim as they approached my vehicle. I stepped out, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the stifling atmosphere that had permeated the car. The officers questioned me, their initial skepticism giving way to concern as I recounted my story. They examined the car, searching for any evidence to corroborate my claims, but found nothing out of the ordinary. No signs of a struggle, no traces of the woman, no lingering scent of that strange perfume. "Are you sure you weren't just imagining things?" one of the officers asked, his tone gentle but skeptical. "It was late. You were tired." I shook my head vehemently. "No, I wasn't imagining it. I know what I saw. I know what happened." The officers exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, one of them spoke. "Look, sir, we'll file a report, but there's not much we can do without any evidence. Maybe you should get some rest, see a doctor." Frustration welled up inside me. I knew they didn't believe me, that they thought I was either lying or delusional, but I couldn't blame them. My story sounded like something out of a horror movie, too bizarre to be true. They left, their flashing lights receding into the distance. I stood there for a long time, the rain washing over me, feeling a profound sense of isolation. Was I going crazy? Had I really imagined the whole thing? As I drove away from the gas station, the events of the night replayed in my mind, each detail vivid and terrifying. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something I was missing. Who was that woman? What did she want? And what was that presence I had felt, that sense of overwhelming evil? The next day, I went to the hospital the woman had mentioned. I spoke to the staff, described the woman I had encountered, but no one recognized her. There were no records of any woman being admitted that night, no reports of anyone matching her description. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of that night continued to haunt me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate, couldn't escape the chilling images that plagued my mind. I started seeing a therapist, hoping to find some answers, some explanation for what had happened. But the therapist offered little comfort. He suggested it was a case of post-traumatic stress, a hallucination brought on by fatigue and stress. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I knew I had encountered something real, something terrifying, something beyond human comprehension. The wind howled like a banshee outside, rattling the windows of our quiet suburban home. Rain lashed against the glass, blurring the lights of the distant town into hazy streaks. Inside, it was warm and cozy, but a knot of anxiety tightened in my chest. My husband, Mark, was away on another one of his endless business trips, leaving me alone with our 5-year-old daughter, Lily. Lily was fast asleep, her favorite teddy bear clutched tightly in her arms. I tucked her in, making sure the covers were secure against the chill that seemed to seep through the walls despite the roaring fire in the hearth. I was about to head to bed myself when I heard a sharp, insistent rapping at the front door. My heart skipped a beat. Who on earth could be calling at this hour? It was almost midnight. I peered through the peephole, but all I could see was darkness. A shiver of unease ran down my spine. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. Silence. Then, another knock, this time more urgent. Hesitantly, I unlocked the door and opened it a crack. Standing on the porch was an elderly woman, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with fear. She wore a thin, threadbare coat that offered little protection against the elements. Rain plastered her gray hair to her forehead, and her wrinkled hands clutched a worn leather purse. "I'm so sorry to bother you," she said, her voice a shaky whisper. but I seem to have lost my way. Could I please use your phone? My car broke down a few miles back, and I need to call for help. I hesitated. My instinct screamed at me to close the door, to tell her to go away. But the woman looked so frail, so desperate. I couldn't just leave her standing out in the cold. Of course, I said, stepping back to let her in. Come in. You must be freezing. The woman stepped inside, her eyes darting nervously around the hallway. I led her into the living room, where a fire crackled cheerfully in the fireplace. Have a seat, I said, gesturing towards the sofa. I'll get you the phone. She sat down slowly, her eyes fixed on the flames. There was something about her, something in her gaze, that made me uneasy. But I pushed the feeling aside, telling myself I was being silly. She was just an old woman who needed help. I handed her the phone and watched as she dialed a number. She spoke in hushed tones, her voice too low for me to make out the words. My anxiety was growing with every passing second. I wished Mark was here. The woman's call was brief. She thanked the person on the other end. Her voice still a hushed monotone, and hung up. She handed me back the phone, a strange glint in her eyes. Thank you, dear, she said. You've been very kind. You're welcome, I replied, trying to maintain a friendly tone despite the growing unease swirling within me. Do you need me to call someone to come get you? No, that's quite all right, she said, rising from the sofa. My nephew is on his way. He should be here any minute. She moved towards the door, and I followed, eager to see her safely on her way. As she reached the hallway, she paused, turning back to face me with a strange, almost predatory smile. You have a lovely home, she said, her eyes scanning the room. And such a beautiful daughter. My blood ran cold. How did she know about Lily? I hadn't mentioned her. Before I could respond, the phone on the side table rang, shattering the tense silence. It was Mark. Hey, honey, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Everything okay? Yeah, just checking in, he said. How's Lily? She's fine, sleeping soundly, I replied, my eyes fixed on the woman who was now standing motionless by the door, her smile widening. Actually, there's something a little strange. I started to tell him about the woman, about how she had appeared on my doorstep asking to use the phone, about the unsettling feeling she gave me. But before I could finish, I felt a sharp pain in my side. I looked down to see a glint of silver, and then a searing agony ripped through me. The woman had lunged at me, a small silver knife clutched in her hand. She plunged it into my side again and again, her face a mask of cold fury. I screamed, the phone clattering to the floor. I stumbled back, clutching at my wounds, blood gushing between my fingers. The woman, her eyes blazing with a terrifying light, yanked the knife free and lunged again. I managed to dodge her attack, the knife grazing my arm. Adrenaline surged through me, fueling a desperate fight for survival. I kicked out, catching her in the shin. She yelped in pain, stumbling back. I seized the opportunity, scrambling away from her, towards the front door. I fumbled with the lock, my fingers slippery with blood. The woman lunged again, but I managed to wrench the door open and stumble out onto the porch. The cold rain lashed against my face, momentarily clearing the fog of fear and pain. I screamed for help, my voice hoarse and raw, but the only answer was the howling wind and the relentless pounding of the rain. I turned to see the woman standing in the doorway, her silhouette framed against the light from within. She didn't pursue me. She just stood there, watching me with those cold, empty eyes, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. Then, she turned and disappeared back into the house. My legs gave way beneath me, and I collapsed onto the rain-soaked porch, my vision blurring. Pain pulsed through me, hot and insistent. I could feel the blood oozing from my wounds, soaking through my clothes. Panic clawed at my throat. I had to get help. I had to get to Lily. With a surge of adrenaline, I pushed myself to my feet. I stumbled down the porch steps, my legs shaking, and lurched towards the driveway. My car was parked there, but the keys were inside the house. I had no choice. I had to go back inside. Fear gnawed at me as I approached the front door. What if the woman was still there? What if she was waiting for me? I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The house was silent, the only sound the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. I retrieved the car keys from the side table, where they lay next to the abandoned phone. Then, I ran to Lily's room. She was still asleep, oblivious to the horror that had unfolded just moments before. Relief washed over me, so intense it almost brought me to my knees. I scooped her up in my arms, her small body warm and soft against mine. "Mommy," she murmured, her eyes fluttering open. "It's okay, sweetheart," I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. "Mommy's here." I carried her out to the car, buckling her into her car seat. Then, I climbed behind the wheel, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the ignition. I backed out of the driveway and sped down the street, the rain blurring the road ahead. I had to get to a hospital. I had to get help. The emergency room was a blur of bright lights and frantic activity. Doctors and nurses swarmed around me, their faces grim. I could hear Lily crying in the distance, her small voice filled with fear and confusion. I was vaguely aware of being wheeled into an operating room, of the sting of antiseptic, of the cold steel of surgical instruments. Then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed, hooked up to an 4-drip. My side was bandaged, and the pain was a dull throb. Lily was asleep in a chair beside my bed, her hand clutching mine. A police officer was sitting in the corner, taking notes. He looked up as I stirred. "Mrs. Walker?" he asked. I nodded. "I'm Detective Miller," he said. "I'm here to ask you some questions about what happened." I told him everything about the knock at the door, the elderly woman, the phone call, the attack. He listened patiently, his expression impassive. "Do you have any idea who this woman might be?" he asked when I had finished. I shook my head. "No, I've never seen her before in my life." "And you didn't notice anything unusual about her? Anything that might help us identify her?" I thought back, trying to remember every detail. "She had a strange tattoo on her wrist," I said. "A small, black bird." Detective Miller's eyebrows rose. "Can you describe it?" I did my best, sketching the image on a notepad he provided. "Thank you, Mrs. Walker," he said. "This could be helpful." He left a short while later, promising to keep me updated on the investigation. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the police made no progress. They never found the woman who attacked me. I recovered from my physical wounds, but the emotional scars remained. I was haunted by nightmares, by flashbacks of the attack. I couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was still out there, watching me, waiting for another opportunity to strike. I became hypervigilant, constantly on edge. I installed security cameras around the house, triple-checking the locks every night. I rarely went out alone, and I never answered the door without first looking through the peephole. The attack had changed me. It had robbed me of my sense of security, my trust in others. I lived in a constant state of fear, terrified that the woman would return to finish what she had started. But I refused to let her win. I would not let her take away my life, my family. I would fight back. I would protect Lily. I just hoped it wasn't too late. One evening, months after the attack, I was browsing online news sites when a headline caught my eye. It was a story about a series of home invasions in a neighboring town. The description of the suspect sent a chill down my spine. An elderly woman with a small, black bird tattoo on her wrist. My heart pounded as I read the article. Could it be her? Could the woman who attacked me be responsible for these other crimes? I clicked on the link to the police sketch of the suspect. It was her. There was no mistaking those cold, calculating eyes, the cruel twist of the lips. A wave of nausea washed over me. She was still out there. She was still a threat. But this time, I knew who she was. I had a name, a face. And I had something she didn't have, I had survived. I printed out the article and the police sketch, and I took them to Detective Miller. He was surprised to see me, but he listened intently as I explained what I had found. "This could be a major break in the case," he said, his eyes scanning the documents. "Thank you, Mrs. Walker. You've been a great help." The police finally had a lead, and they were able to track the woman down. She was arrested a few weeks later and charged with multiple counts of assault and robbery. I testified against her in court, my voice trembling but firm. I recounted the details of the attack, the terror I had felt, the lingering fear that still haunted me. The woman was found guilty and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. Justice had been served, but even with the woman behind bars, I couldn't completely shake off the fear. The attack had left a deep scar on my psyche, a constant reminder of my vulnerability. I knew I would never be the same, but I also knew that I was a survivor. I had faced my fears, and I had emerged stronger. I had protected my daughter, and I had helped bring a dangerous criminal to justice. And that was something to be proud of. Years passed. Lily grew up, happy and healthy. The nightmares faded, and the fear subsided. But I never forgot the woman with the blackbird tattoo. She was a reminder that evil exists in the world, but so does courage and resilience and the enduring power of love. And sometimes, when the wind howled outside and the rain lashed against the windows, I would think of her, and I would whisper a silent prayer of thanks for the strength that had allowed me to survive. The scent of pine needles was always the first thing that hit me when I stepped out onto the porch each morning. Crisp, clean, and invigorating. The perfect way to start the day in our secluded cabin nestled deep in the heart of the Adirondack Mountains. My wife, Sarah, loved it here. She thrived on the quiet solitude, the symphony of birdsong, and the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves, painting dappled patterns on the forest floor. Our son, little Ethan, was still too young to appreciate the nuances of nature's beauty, but he loved exploring the woods behind our cabin, his laughter echoing through the trees as he chased butterflies and collected smooth, gray stones from the creek bed. Life was simple, peaceful, happy. We'd moved here to escape the hustle and bustle of city life, craving a slower pace, a deeper connection with nature and with each other. And for a while, that's exactly what we found. But then, the night started to change. It began subtly, a creak on the stairs that I'd never noticed before, the floorboards groaning under the weight of nothing, a fleeting shadow in the periphery of my vision that vanished when I turned my head. I dismissed it all, of course. An old house settling, my imagination running wild in the stillness of the night. But the disturbances grew more frequent, more insistent. One night, I woke with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. A low, guttural moan seemed to reverberate through the cabin, seeping into my bones. Sarah slept soundly beside me, oblivious to the unsettling sound. I lay there, frozen, listening intently, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. It seemed to be coming from downstairs, from the living room. Curiosity and a healthy dose of fear propelled me out of bed. I crept across the room, the floorboards cold beneath my bare feet, and eased open the bedroom door. The hallway was pitch black, the only light a sliver of moon filtering in through the window at the far end. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the light switch, a primal instinct warning me not to pierce the darkness. But I pushed the fear aside, flicked on the switch, and stepped into the hallway. The moan came again, louder this time, closer. I moved towards the living room, each step sending a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. As I reached the doorway, I peered cautiously around the corner, and that's when I saw it. Standing in the middle of the living room, bathed in the pale moonlight streaming through the window, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, its edges blurry and indistinct. It seemed to be made of shadows, coalescing and shifting like smoke. Fear gripped me, icy and paralyzing. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't even scream. I just stood there, transfixed, as the figure remained motionless, its presence filling the room with an oppressive weight. Then, As quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. One moment it was there, the next it had simply dissolved into the darkness. I blinked, my eyes frantically searching the room, but there was nothing, just the familiar furniture, the crackling fireplace, and the unsettling silence that followed in its wake. I stumbled back to bed, my mind reeling, my body trembling. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, the image of the shadowy figure seared into my memory. Sleep was impossible. Every creak, every groan of the house sent a shiver down my spine. Dawn couldn't come soon enough. In the morning, I told Sarah about what I'd seen. She listened patiently, her brow furrowed with concern. She tried to reassure me, suggesting it was just a bad dream, a trick of the light, anything but what I knew I had witnessed. But her words offered little comfort. The fear lingered, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. I tried to put it out of my mind, to focus on the everyday routines of life in the cabin. But the nights were torture. I lay awake, listening, waiting, dreading the moment the shadow would return. And it did. A few nights later, the moan woke me again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace and crept downstairs, determined to confront whatever was haunting our home. The living room was bathed in darkness, the only light coming from the dying embers in the fireplace. I stood in the doorway, my heart pounding, the poker clutched tightly in my hand. And there it was again, the shadowy figure, taller and more menacing than before, standing in the center of the room. I took a step forward, raising the poker. "Who are you?" I croaked, my voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, its presence radiating an aura of malevolence. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice gaining a little strength. Still no response. But then, the figure began to move. It glided towards me, its shadowy form rippling and distorting as it approached. Panic surged through me. I raised the poker higher, ready to strike, but the figure simply passed through it, its touch sending a chill down my spine. I stumbled back, my foot catching on the rug. I fell, the poker clattering to the floor. The figure loomed over me, its form shifting, becoming more defined. I could see its face now, pale and gaunt, with eyes that burned like embers. Its mouth opened in a silent scream, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Terror overwhelmed me. I scrambled to my feet, my mind screaming at me to run. I fled from the living room, the figure's chilling laughter echoing behind me. I raced up the stairs, my lungs burning, my legs aching. I burst into the bedroom, slamming the door behind me, and threw myself against it, my body shaking uncontrollably. Sarah woke with a gasp, her eyes wide with alarm. "Mark, what's wrong?" I couldn't speak. I just pointed towards the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. She listened intently, her face pale. "I don't hear anything," she whispered. "It's here," I choked out. "In the house." She held me close, trying to soothe me, but the fear was too strong. I couldn't shake the image of the figure, its chilling laughter, its burning eyes. I knew it was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next opportunity to terrorize us. We didn't sleep for the rest of the night. We huddled together in bed, listening to every creak and groan of the house. Dawn brought little relief. The fear remained, a constant companion, casting a dark shadow over our once peaceful existence. The shadow had invaded our home, our lives, and I knew, with a chilling certainty, that it wasn't going to leave. The days that followed were a blur of fear and anxiety. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden menace. Every creak of the house sent shivers down my spine. I tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy for Sarah and Ethan's sake, but it was a losing battle. The fear was a constant weight on my shoulders, a dark cloud that followed me everywhere. Sarah, bless her heart, tried to be supportive. She suggested we see a doctor, maybe get some sleeping pills, anything to help me get some rest. but I knew it wouldn't help. This wasn't a medical problem. It was something far more sinister. I started researching local history, scouring old books and websites for any mention of hauntings in the area. I learned that our cabin had been built on land that was once part of a logging camp. There had been an accident years ago, a fire that had claimed the lives of several workers. Could one of them be the source of the haunting? The more I learned, the more convinced I became that we were dealing with a restless spirit. But what did it want? Why was it tormenting us? One evening, as I was poring over a dusty old volume on local ghost lore, I stumbled upon a passage that sent a chill down my spine. It described a ritual used to communicate with spirits, a way to learn their intentions and, hopefully, find a way to appease them. It was a long shot, but I was desperate. I gathered the necessary materials: a candle, a mirror, and a piece of chalk. That night, after Sarah and Ethan were asleep, I went down to the living room. I placed the mirror on the mantelpiece, lit the candle, and sat down on the floor facing it. Then, with a trembling hand, I drew a circle around myself with the chalk. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and began to recite the incantation I had found in the book. The words felt strange and foreign on my tongue, but I persevered. As I spoke, the air in the room grew heavy, and a sense of unease settled over me. Suddenly, the candle flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, I heard it, a low moan, coming from the corner of the room. I opened my eyes, my gaze drawn to the source of the sound. And there it was, the shadowy figure, standing in the darkness, its eyes burning like coals. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't speak. It simply glided towards me, its form rippling and distorting as it approached. I shrank back against the wall, my body frozen with fear. The figure stopped in front of me, its face inches from mine. I could see its features now, more clearly than ever before. It was the face of a man, young and handsome, but twisted in agony. His eyes were filled with pain and anger, and his mouth was open in a silent scream. "Please," I begged, "tell me what you want." The figure's lips moved, but no sound came out. Then, it raised its hand and pointed towards the fireplace. I followed its gaze and saw a loose brick in the hearth. I scrambled to my feet and knelt down, my fingers probing the brick. It came loose easily, revealing a small, hollow space behind it. Inside, I found a small, leather-bound journal. I pulled it out and opened it. The pages were filled with faded ink, the writing barely legible. I held it closer to the candle and began to read. The journal belonged to a young man named Thomas, a logger who had worked at the camp that once stood on this land. He had fallen in love with a local girl, but their families had forbidden them to marry. In despair, Thomas had taken his own life, hanging himself from a tree in the woods behind the cabin. His spirit had been trapped here ever since, unable to find peace. He had been trying to communicate with me, to show me where his journal was hidden. He wanted me to know his story, to understand his pain. As I read the final entry, tears welled up in my eyes. Thomas had written about his love for the girl, his despair at their separation, and his hope that one day they would be reunited. He had begged for forgiveness and asked for someone to help him find peace. I closed the journal, my heart aching for the young man's tragic fate. I looked up at the shadowy figure, and I saw that the anger and pain in its eyes had been replaced by a glimmer of hope. "I understand," I said softly. "I will help you." The figure nodded slowly, its form beginning to fade. "Thank you," it whispered, its voice barely audible. "Thank you." And then it was gone. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the frantic beating of my own heart. I sat there for a long time, the journal clutched in my hands, trying to process everything that had happened. The fear was gone, replaced by a strange sense of peace. I had helped Thomas find release, and in doing so, I had found a measure of peace myself. But my journey wasn't over yet. I knew I couldn't just leave Thomas's journal hidden away in the fireplace. His story deserved to be told, his memory honored. I decided to transcribe his journal, to share his words with the world. It was a painstaking process, the ink faded and the handwriting difficult to decipher. But as I worked, I felt a connection to Thomas, a sense of kinship with this young man who had lived and loved and died on this land so many years ago. His story resonated with me, his pain and despair echoing through the years. As I transcribed the journal, I learned more about Thomas's life, his hopes and dreams, his love for the girl who had been forbidden to him. I learned about the harsh realities of life in the logging camp, the dangers and hardships faced by the men who worked there. And I learned about the deep, abiding love that Thomas had carried in his heart, even in the face of tragedy. When I finished transcribing the journal, I knew I had to do something with it. I contacted a local historical society and offered to donate the journal and my transcription. They were thrilled, and they arranged for a small exhibit to be created, showcasing Thomas's story and the history of the logging camp. The exhibit was a success, drawing visitors from all over the region. People were moved by Thomas's story, his tragic love affair, and his untimely death. They left messages of condolence and support, expressing their sympathy for Thomas and their gratitude for his journal. I felt a sense of closure, knowing that Thomas's story had finally been told, his memory honored. He was no longer a nameless shadow, haunting the woods behind our cabin. He was a real person, with a name and a story, a man who had loved and lost and found peace at last. The cabin felt different now, lighter, brighter. The shadows were still there, but they no longer held any menace. They were just shadows, reminders of the past, of the lives that had been lived and loved on this land. Sarah and Ethan were happy too. The fear had gone from their eyes, replaced by a sense of wonder and curiosity. They loved exploring the woods, searching for clues to the past, imagining the lives of the people who had lived here before us. We stayed in the cabin for many years, raising our family, making our own memories. The shadow of Thomas was always with us, a reminder of the fragility of life, the importance of love, and the power of forgiveness. And sometimes, on quiet nights, when the wind whispered through the pines, I could almost hear Thomas's voice, whispering his thanks, his love, his peace. The worst night of my life started out pretty normal. It was a Friday, and I was excited for the weekend. My older brother, Jake, was supposed to take me to the park the next day to play basketball. Jake was the coolest person I knew. He was 16, had a driver's license, and even had a girlfriend named Sarah. I was only 8, so having Jake as a brother was like having a built-in superhero. Mom made spaghetti and meatballs for dinner, my favorite. After we ate, Jake went out with some friends, and I watched cartoons until bedtime. Mom tucked me in, kissed me goodnight, and turned on my nightlight, a little plastic spaceship that projected stars onto my ceiling. I fell asleep pretty quickly, dreaming about aliens and spaceships. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. Something had pulled me from my sleep, like a feeling of being watched. My room was dark except for the faint glow of the spaceship on my ceiling. I lay still, listening. At first, I didn't hear anything, but then there it was again, a soft scratching sound, like fingernails on wood. It was coming from my bedroom door. My heart started to pound in my chest. I squeezed my eyes shut, pulling the covers up over my head. It's just the wind, I told myself. It's just the house settling. But even as I thought those words, I knew it was something else. The scratching sound grew louder, and then I heard a creak as the door slowly began to open. I peeked out from under the covers, my eyes wide with fear. The doorway was filled with a tall, dark figure. I couldn't make out any features, just a silhouette against the dim light from the hallway. It was like a living shadow. Terror seized me. I squeezed my eyes shut again, holding my breath, pretending to be asleep. Please go away. Please go away, I pleaded silently. I lay perfectly still, listening to my own ragged breathing under the covers. After what felt like forever, I heard the floorboards creak again, The shadow was moving. I heard its footsteps slowly receding down the hallway. Curiosity battled with fear. What was that thing? Where was it going? I had to know. Cautiously, I lowered the covers and slipped out of bed. My bare feet were cold against the wooden floor. I tiptoed to the door and peered out into the hallway. The shadow was gone. I crept down the hallway, following the sound of the footsteps. They led me to the top of the stairs. I hesitated, my hand gripping the banister. Should I go down? What if the shadow was waiting for me? But something compelled me forward. I took a step, then another, my heart pounding with each creak of the stairs. As I reached the bottom, I saw it. The shadow was standing in the middle of the living room, its back to me. I froze, unsure what to do. Should I turn and run? Should I call out for my parents? But they weren't home. Then the shadow spoke. Its voice was deep and raspy, sending shivers down my spine. "Go back upstairs," it said. The words hung in the air, heavy and menacing. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and fled back up the stairs, my feet barely touching the ground. I burst into my room, slammed the door shut, and dove back into bed, burying myself under the covers. I lay there, trembling, listening for any sound. But there was only silence. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside my window, sent a jolt of fear through me. I lay curled in a ball under the covers, too scared to even move. Finally, I heard the familiar crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. Relief washed over me like a tidal wave. My parents were home. I scrambled out of bed and ran to the top of the stairs. "Mom, Dad," I shouted, my voice trembling. They rushed in, their faces etched with worry. "David, what's wrong?" Mom asked, her voice filled with concern. I could barely speak, the words tumbling over each other. There was a shadow in my room. It told me to go upstairs. My parents exchanged a look of alarm. Dad's face hardened. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm. He went to the closet and retrieved his shotgun. My eyes widened. I had never seen him with a gun before. Mom, meanwhile, was already on the phone with the police. Dad moved through the house, checking every room, every closet, every corner. He was methodical and thorough, his movements betraying years of military training. Mom followed close behind, her hand clutching her chest. When Dad returned to the living room, he looked grim. "There's no one here," he said, "but there are signs of forced entry." The back door was jimmied open. The police arrived shortly after. 2 officers, a man and a woman, listened patiently as I recounted my story. They asked me questions about the shadow, its voice, its movements. I answered as best as I could, but the details were already starting to blur in my memory. The officers searched the house again, but they found nothing. They took fingerprints, but they were smudged and inconclusive. Eventually, they left, promising to keep an eye on the neighborhood. My parents tried to reassure me. They told me that I was safe now, that the bad guy was gone. But their words felt hollow. I knew that the shadow was still out there, somewhere in the darkness. That night, I slept in my parents' bed, squeezed between them. But even their presence couldn't chase away the fear. I lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the house, imagining the shadow lurking just outside the door. The next morning, Jake came home from the hospital. He had a broken arm and a few cuts and bruises, but he was otherwise okay. I was so relieved to see him that I burst into tears. My parents told him what had happened while he was gone. He listened intently, his brow furrowed with concern. "Are you sure you saw someone, David?" he asked. "Maybe it was just a bad dream." I shook my head vehemently. "No, it was real. I saw it. It told me to go back upstairs." Jake looked at me for a long moment, then he sighed. "Okay, little bro, I believe you. Just try not to worry about it, okay? It's over now." But it wasn't over. Not for me. The shadow had left its mark on me, a deep and chilling fear that I couldn't shake off. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and fear. I refused to be alone in the house, even for a minute. I insisted on sleeping with my parents every night, and I would cling to them whenever they left my sight. The nightmares started a few days later. Vivid, terrifying dreams of the shadow. Sometimes it would be in my room, its voice whispering menacing threats. Other times it would be chasing me through the dark hallways of our house, its footsteps echoing behind me. I would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. My parents tried everything they could to help me. They took me to a therapist who taught me relaxation techniques and coping mechanisms. They bought me a guard dog, a big, friendly Labrador named Buddy, who became my constant companion. They even installed a security system with alarms on every window and door. But nothing seemed to completely erase the fear that had taken root in my heart. The shadow had become a part of me, a dark passenger that I couldn't shake off. As I grew older, the nightmares gradually faded and the acute anxiety lessened. But the memory of that night remained, a scar on my psyche. I became hypervigilant, always on the lookout for danger. I double-checked every lock, every window, every time I entered or left the house. I was wary of strangers, and I avoided being alone in the dark. Even now, years later, the shadow still haunts me. It lingers in the back of my mind, a reminder of the fragility of safety and the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected places. I often wonder who or what that shadow was. Was it just a burglar, as the police suspected? Or was it something more sinister, something that defied explanation? I may never know the answer, but one thing is certain. That night changed me forever. It taught me that even in the safety of our own homes, we are not immune to the darkness that exists in the world. And it left me with a profound appreciation for the importance of vigilance and the preciousness of those we love. The snow fell in thick, lazy flakes, blanketing the quiet suburban street in a pristine white. Inside Jake's old Victorian house, the atmosphere was anything but serene. New Year's Eve was in full swing, and the place was packed. Music blared, laughter echoed, and the air was thick with the mingled scents of cheap beer, pizza, and that strange, almost metallic tang that always seems to accompany a crowd of people crammed together. I should probably introduce myself. I'm Alex, and I've been friends with Jake since we were kids. He's always been the quiet one, a little bit of a loner, but with a dry wit that could catch you off guard. Tonight, though, he was in his element, a wide grin plastered on his face as he moved through the crowd, refilling drinks and cracking jokes. Chris, on the other hand, was the life of the party, as usual. Loud, boisterous, and always ready with a bad joke or a ridiculous story. He was holding court in the corner, a gaggle of admirers hanging on his every word. I leaned against the wall, nursing a lukewarm beer, watching the chaos unfold with a detached amusement. Parties weren't really my thing, but it was New Year's Eve, and I wasn't about to spend it alone in my apartment, staring at the ceiling. As the night wore on, the crowd started to thin. People paired off, mumbled their goodbyes, and stumbled out into the snowy night. By 2 a.m., only a handful of us remained, sprawled across the living room floor amidst a sea of empty cups and crumpled napkins. Jake had crashed on the couch, snoring softly, while Chris was attempting to serenade us with a slurred rendition of Auld Lang Syne. I was about to call it a night when I heard it, a faint creaking sound, like old wood groaning under a weight. It seemed to be coming from downstairs, from the basement. I glanced at Chris, who had thankfully stopped his caterwauling and was now staring at me with a puzzled expression. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, what the hell was that?" We listened intently, but the sound had stopped. Just as we were about to dismiss it as our imagination, it came again, louder this time, followed by a series of soft thuds. A shiver ran down my spine. Jake's house was old, with a dark, unfinished basement that had always given me the creeps. I'd never liked going down there, even in the daytime. "Maybe we should check it out," Chris said, a mischievous glint in his eye. I hesitated. "Are you crazy? It's probably just the pipes or something." "Come on, scaredy cat," he taunted. What's the worst that could happen? Famous last words, right? The creaking sound intensified, now accompanied by a rhythmic thump, like someone shifting their weight back and forth. Chris, emboldened by a mixture of morbid curiosity and liquid courage, grabbed a half-empty bottle of whiskey from the floor and took a swig. "Well," he announced, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, "what are we waiting for?" He started towards the hallway that led to the basement door. I hesitated, a knot of apprehension tightening in my stomach. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing on end, and a cold dread was starting to seep into my bones. "Chris, I don't know about this." He rolled his eyes. "Don't be such a wimp, Alex. It's probably just a raccoon or something." Easy for him to say. He wasn't the one who had grown up hearing whispered stories about Jake's creepy old house, about the strange things that had supposedly happened there. Suddenly, Jake stirred on the couch, mumbling incoherently. Chris and I exchanged a nervous glance. If Jake woke up and found us gone, he'd freak out. "Jake," I said, shaking his shoulder gently. "Jake, wake up." He groaned and rolled over, burying his face in a cushion. "Dude, come on," Chris urged. "We're going to investigate the spooky noises." "You in?" Jake mumbled something that sounded like, "Go away," and swatted at us with his hand. Chris shrugged. "Well, that's a yes in my book." I wasn't so sure, but I let Chris drag me towards the hallway. As we passed the kitchen, I spotted a glint of metal on the countertop, a set of steak knives. "Wait here," I said to Chris, grabbing one of the knives. It was probably pointless, considering how much we'd had to drink, but it made me feel a little bit safer. I grabbed another one for Chris, and we cautiously made our way towards the basement door. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the living room behind us. The air was heavy and still, and the silence was almost deafening. As we approached the door, I could hear the creaking and thumping more clearly now, sending shivers down my spine. Chris reached for the doorknob. "Ready," he whispered, a grin spreading across his face. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest, as I'll ever be. He threw open the door, and a blast of cold, musty air hit us in the face. The stairs leading down to the basement were shrouded in darkness, the bottom disappearing into a black abyss. "Ladies first," Chris said, gesturing with mock chivalry. I shot him a glare and cautiously started down the stairs, the knife clutched tightly in my hand. The steps groaned beneath my weight, and the creaking sound seemed to grow louder with each step I took. The basement was even colder and darker than I remembered. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and mildew, and I could feel a strange, unsettling energy pressing down on me. Chris fumbled for the light switch, but nothing happened. "Great," he muttered. "Just great." He pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. Slowly, we made our way across the uneven floor, our eyes scanning the shadows. There was a workbench against one wall, cluttered with tools and old paint cans. In the corner, a pile of forgotten furniture was covered in dust sheets, and in the center of the room, bathed in the eerie glow of the flashlight, was a rocking chair. An old, wooden rocking chair, gently swaying back and forth. The sight of that rocking chair, swaying gently in the silence of the basement, sent a wave of icy fear washing over me. It was an old, antique chair, with a high back and intricately carved arms. The wood was dark, almost black, and it gleamed faintly in the dim light. "What the?" Chris breathed, his voice barely a whisper. We stood there, frozen in place, staring at the chair as it moved back and forth, back and forth. The rhythmic creaking and thumping that we had heard upstairs were clearly coming from the chair, but there was no one sitting in it. No breeze, no draft, no explanation. "This is freaking me out," Chris whispered, his bravado starting to crumble. I nodded, my throat tight with fear. I couldn't take my eyes off the chair. It was as if it was beckoning us closer, inviting us to sit down, to become part of its strange, silent dance. "Maybe we should just go," I said, my voice trembling. But Chris, his curiosity now outweighing his fear, shook his head. No way, man. We have to find out what's going on. He took a step closer, his flashlight beam trained on the chair. As he approached, the rocking slowed, then stopped altogether. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Chris reached out and touched the back of the chair, his fingers tracing the smooth, cold wood. As he did so, a low groan echoed through the basement, like a sigh escaping from the depths of the earth. Chris recoiled his hand as if he had been burned. "Dude, did you hear that?" he whispered, his eyes wide with fear. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. We were not alone in that basement. Something else was there with us, something unseen, something ancient and malevolent. Chris, his face pale and his hands shaking, took a step back. "I think we should go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But it was too late. As Chris turned to leave, the rocking chair suddenly sprang to life, its back slamming against the wall with a loud bang. Chris yelped in surprise and stumbled backwards, tripping over a loose floorboard and falling to the ground with a thud. I gasped and rushed towards him, my knife raised. But before I could reach him, the chair started rocking violently, its creaking and thumping filling the basement with a deafening cacophony. The shadows seemed to dance and writhe around us, and I could feel the cold, unseen presence closing in. "Get up!" I shouted to Chris, who was scrambling to his feet. We turned and ran, our footsteps echoing through the darkness. We scrambled up the stairs, our hearts pounding in our chests, the terrifying sound of the rocking chair pursuing us. We burst through the basement door and into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind us. We leaned against the door, gasping for breath, our bodies trembling with fear. The creaking and thumping continued for a few moments, then slowly faded away. We stood there in the silence, our eyes locked, the horror of what we had just experienced etched on our faces. We didn't speak for a long time, just stood there in the hallway, our breath coming in ragged gasps. The silence was broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room and the distant rumble of a passing car. Finally, I managed to croak out, "What the hell was that?" Chris shook his head, his face pale and drawn. "I don't know, man. I don't know." We went back to the living room and collapsed onto the couch, our bodies still trembling. Jake was still asleep, oblivious to the terror we had just experienced. We didn't try to wake him. We just sat there, staring blankly at the wall, trying to process what had happened. The first rays of dawn were filtering through the windows when we finally decided to go to bed. We didn't talk about the rocking chair, but it hung heavy in the air between us, an unspoken specter that haunted our thoughts. I tossed and turned for hours, unable to shake the image of that chair, swaying gently in the darkness. The creaking, the thumping, the feeling of an unseen presence. It all played over and over in my mind, sending chills down my spine. I finally drifted off to sleep just as the sun was rising, but my dreams were filled with disturbing images of the rocking chair, its dark wood gleaming in the moonlight, its silent dance beckoning me closer. When I woke up, it was late afternoon. Jake was in the kitchen, making coffee, and Chris was sprawled on the floor, snoring softly. I joined them at the table, and we sat in silence for a while, sipping our coffee and avoiding each other's gaze. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "So," he said, his voice hesitant, "what happened last night?" I glanced at Chris, who just shrugged and looked away. I knew we couldn't keep what had happened a secret, but I also didn't want to scare Jake. He was already a bit on edge, living in that old house by himself. I took a deep breath and told him everything. About the creaking sound, the descent into the basement, the rocking chair, the unseen presence. Jake listened intently, his eyes wide with disbelief. When I finished, he sat there for a moment, silent, his face pale. "You're kidding, right?" he finally said, his voice weak. I shook my head. "I wish I was." Jake got up and went to the window, staring out at the snow-covered street. He stood there for a long time, lost in thought. When he finally turned back to us, his face was grim. "I think I know what's going on," he said, his voice low. He told us about his grandmother, who had lived in the house before him. She had been a strange woman, reclusive and eccentric. She had spent most of her time in her rocking chair, reading or knitting. She had died in the house, in that very chair. "My mom kept the chair after she died," Jake said. "She said it was a family heirloom. She never told me the whole story, but I think she was afraid of it." He looked at us, his eyes filled with fear. "I think my grandmother's spirit is attached to that chair." The revelation of the chair's history hung in the air like a thick fog, chilling us to the bone. Jake's grandmother, a recluse with a penchant for the macabre, dying in that very chair. It was all too perfect, too eerie. We spent the rest of the day huddled around Jake's laptop, scouring the internet for any information about haunted rocking chairs or the history of his house. We found countless stories, some more outlandish than others, about objects holding onto the spirits of their former owners. There were even a few articles about chairs specifically, how their gentle rocking motion could somehow retain the energy of those who had spent countless hours in them. One particularly creepy website detailed the phenomenon of sympathetic magic, where objects become imbued with the emotions and intentions of their users. Apparently, rocking chairs, with their repetitive motion and association with comfort and relaxation, were particularly susceptible to this kind of energy imprint. "So, you're saying," Chris said, his voice hushed, "that the chair is basically a battery for Grandma's ghost?" I shuddered. "Something like that." We dug deeper, trying to find anything about Jake's grandmother, her life, or her death. But there was nothing. It was as if she had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a haunted rocking chair and a chilling legacy. As the day wore on, a sense of dread settled over us. We knew we couldn't just ignore the chair. It was a ticking time bomb, a potential portal to something dark and dangerous. But what could we do? Jake suggested calling his mother, hoping she might know more about the chair's history or have some advice on how to deal with it. But the thought of explaining the situation to his mom, who was already a bit superstitious, filled us with dread. "Maybe we should call someone," Chris said, his voice barely a whisper, "like a ghost hunter or something." I scoffed. "You mean those guys on TV who run around with cameras and EMF readers? Come on, Chris, you don't actually believe in that stuff, do you?" He shrugged. "I don't know, man. After last night, I'm not ruling anything out." Jake, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "I know someone," he said, "an old friend of my mom's. She's kind of a psychic." I raised an eyebrow. "A psychic? Seriously?" Jake nodded. "She's the real deal. My mom used to consult with her all the time. She helped her with some things." He trailed off, his eyes clouding with a distant memory. We exchanged a skeptical glance, but desperation was starting to outweigh our cynicism. What did we have to lose? Jake dug through his mom's old address book and found a phone number for a woman named Evelyn. He hesitated for a moment, then dialed the number. The phone rang a few times, then a woman's voice answered, warm and soothing with a hint of something ancient and wise. "Hello? Evelyn? Hi, it's Jake. Jake Miller. My mom used to know you." There was a pause, then a soft gasp. "Jake, oh my dear boy, it's been so long. How is your mother?" "She's fine," Jake said, his voice trembling slightly. "Listen, Evelyn, I need your help. Something strange is happening." He hesitated, unsure how to explain the situation. "It's about a rocking chair," he finally said, his voice dropping to a whisper. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Evelyn's voice, softer now, almost a whisper. "A rocking chair, you say? Tell me, dear boy, what makes this chair so special?" Jake hesitated again, then, with a deep breath, recounted the events of the previous night. The strange noises, the chilling discovery in the basement, the feeling of an unseen presence, and the unsettling connection to his deceased grandmother. He even mentioned the online research we had done, the theories about sympathetic magic and residual energy. When he finished, there was another long silence. I could hear Jake's shallow breaths on the other end of the line, the tension crackling in the air. Finally, Evelyn spoke, her voice grave and laced with concern. "Jake," she said, "I believe you, and I fear you may be in more danger than you realize." A shiver ran down my spine. Even over the phone, Evelyn's words carried a weight of authority, an ancient wisdom that sent a prickle of unease across my skin. "What do you mean?" Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. "That chair," Evelyn said, "it's not just an object. It's a conduit, a doorway to something else. And whatever is attached to it, it's not your grandmother." My blood ran cold. Not his grandmother? Then who? What? But the rocking, the noises. Jake stammered. "It's mimicking," Evelyn explained. "Feeding on your fear, your memories. It wants you to believe it's your grandmother, to lure you closer." "Lure us closer?" I echoed, the image of the chair beckoning us in the darkness flashing through my mind. "Yes," Evelyn confirmed. "It wants to connect, to feed. And the more you interact with it, the stronger it becomes." "But why?" Jake asked, his voice laced with desperation. "What does it want?" Evelyn sighed. "That, my dear boy, is what we need to find out. But be warned, the answers may be more disturbing than you can imagine. This entity, it's old, powerful, and it's been waiting a long time for this opportunity." A wave of nausea washed over me. We weren't just dealing with a haunted rocking chair. We were dealing with something ancient, malevolent, and hungry. Evelyn then gave us instructions. She told us to avoid the basement at all costs, to not touch or even look at the chair. She also gave us a list of things to gather: sage, salt, iron nails, and a mirror. "These will offer some protection," she explained, "but it's only a temporary measure. We need to understand what we're dealing with before we can truly banish it." She promised to come to the house as soon as possible, but warned us to be vigilant in the meantime. "And Jake," she added, her voice taking on a maternal tone, "please be careful. This entity, it's drawn to you, to your bloodline." The line went dead, leaving us in stunned silence. Jake's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Bloodline?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "What does she mean by that?" We didn't have an answer, but as I looked at Jake, a chilling thought crossed my mind. What if this wasn't just about a haunted rocking chair? What if it was about something much bigger, something connected to Jake's family history, something dark and sinister that had been lurking in the shadows for generations? The call with Evelyn left us shaken and filled with a sense of foreboding. We immediately set about gathering the items she had requested. Sage and salt were easy enough to find in Jake's kitchen, but the iron nails proved to be more of a challenge. We eventually found a rusty old box of them in the garage, hidden away in a corner. As we searched for the mirror, we stumbled upon a hidden door in the hallway leading to the attic. Curiosity piqued, we cautiously opened it, revealing a steep, narrow staircase leading up into the darkness. "Should we?" Chris asked, his voice hesitant. I felt a pull towards the attic, a sense that there might be something important hidden up there. Jake, however, seemed reluctant. "I don't know," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I've never been up there. My mom always kept it locked." Despite his apprehension, we decided to explore the attic. Armed with our flashlights, we cautiously ascended the creaky stairs, the dust swirling around us in the dim light. The attic was a treasure trove of forgotten memories, old trunks overflowing with clothes, toys, and faded photographs, stacks of dusty books and yellowed newspapers, and in the corner, a cobweb-covered easel with a half-finished painting. As I examined the painting, a chill ran down my spine. It was a portrait of a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes dark and haunting. She was sitting in a rocking chair, a faint smile playing on her lips. "That's her," Jake whispered, his voice filled with dread. That's my grandmother. We continued to explore the attic, our hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. We found old journals filled with cryptic entries, strange symbols drawn on the walls, and a collection of antique dolls with unsettlingly lifelike eyes. As we delved deeper into the attic, a sense of unease grew within us. It was as if the air itself was heavy with secrets, with a dark history that was slowly revealing itself. Suddenly, a loud crash from downstairs startled us. We froze, our blood turning to ice. "What was that?" Chris whispered, his eyes wide with fear. We rushed down the stairs, our hearts pounding in our chests. As we reached the hallway, we saw Jake's front door wide open, the wind howling through the house. And then we saw it, the rocking chair. It was no longer in the basement. It was in the living room, sitting in the center of the room, its dark wood gleaming in the dim light. And it was rocking, back and forth, as if inviting us to join its dance. A wave of icy dread washed over me. The rocking chair, now in the living room, felt different, more menacing, more alive. Its gentle sway seemed to mock us, a predator toying with its prey. "It's a trap," I yelled, grabbing Jake and Chris by the arms. "We need to get out of here." But it was too late. As we turned to run, the lights flickered and died, plunging the house into darkness. A cold wind swept through the room, slamming the front door shut with a deafening bang. We were trapped. The only light came from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the windows, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. And in the center of it all, the rocking chair swayed back and forth, its silhouette a dark omen against the pale moonlight. Suddenly, a voice, cold and raspy, echoed through the room. "Leaving so soon?" The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, whispering through the walls, slithering through the air. I felt a hand on my shoulder, cold and clammy. I whirled around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no one there. "Who's there?" Jake's voice trembled in the darkness. "You know who I am," the voice hissed. "I've been waiting for you." A floorboard creaked behind us. We spun around, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. But again, there was nothing there. The rocking chair creaked louder now, its rhythm intensifying. And with each creak, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, a chilling presence seeping into our bones. "We have to do something," Chris whispered, his voice filled with fear. I nodded, my mind racing. Evelyn had told us to use the sage, the salt, the nails, the mirror. But how? What were we supposed to do? Suddenly, I remembered the attic, the strange symbols drawn on the walls. Were they some kind of protection? A way to banish the entity? "The attic!" I yelled. "We need to go back to the attic." We stumbled through the darkness, our hands outstretched, searching for the hallway. The voice followed us, whispering taunts, threats, promises. "You can't escape me," it hissed. "I'm a part of you now." We reached the hallway and scrambled up the stairs, the creaking of the rocking chair echoing behind us. We burst into the attic, slamming the door shut behind us. The attic was even darker than before, the moonlight barely penetrating the dusty windows. We fumbled for our flashlights, the beams of light dancing across the cluttered space. And then we saw them, the symbols. They were glowing. A faint, ethereal light emanated from the strange symbols on the walls, pulsating with an unseen energy. As we watched, the symbols began to move, shifting and swirling, forming new patterns, new configurations. The air crackled with power, and a sense of ancient magic filled the room. The rocking chair's creaking grew louder, closer. It was coming for us. We had to do something. But what? I looked at the symbols, at the strange, swirling patterns, and then I understood. The mirror. I yelled, "We need to use the mirror." I grabbed the small, antique mirror we had found in the attic and held it up to the symbols. The light from the symbols reflected off the mirror, amplifying, intensifying. The rocking chair's creaking reached a fever pitch, then abruptly stopped. A silence descended upon the house, heavy and absolute. And then, a scream. A blood-curdling scream that echoed through the house, shattering the silence. It was followed by another scream, and another, and another. The screams grew louder, more frantic, more desperate. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence returned deeper, more profound than before. We stood there in the darkness, our breath held, our hearts pounding in our chests. What had happened? Had we banished the entity? Or had it simply retreated, waiting for another opportunity to strike? We didn't know, and we were too afraid to find out. We left the attic, leaving the mirror reflecting the glowing symbols. We left the house, leaving the rocking chair silent in the living room. We left the past behind, but the questions lingered. What was the entity? What did it want? And what was its connection to Jake's family? We didn't have answers, and perhaps we never would. But one thing was certain. We would never forget the night of the rocking chair. The silence of the empty house pressed in on me. It was a Friday night, and my parents were out for the evening, leaving me alone to enjoy the peace and quiet. Or so I thought. I was curled up on the couch, engrossed in a horror movie marathon, the flickering light from the television casting long, dancing shadows across the living room. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled like a banshee, creating an eerie soundtrack to my solo movie night. Suddenly, a sharp rap on the front door cut through the sound of the storm and the movie's tense score. I jumped, my heart pounding in my chest. It was late, nearly midnight, and I wasn't expecting any visitors. I glanced at the clock on the wall, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. Who could be out there in this weather at this hour? Hesitantly, I rose from the couch, my bare feet padding silently across the carpet. As I approached the door, the knocking came again, more insistent this time. I peered through the peephole, my breath catching in my throat. Standing on the porch, illuminated by the dim porch light, was an old woman. She was hunched over, her face obscured by the deep shadows of her hood. Her clothes were dark and ragged, plastered to her thin frame by the rain. One skeletal hand clutched a worn, leather bag, while the other was raised to knock again. Even through the distorted view of the peephole, I could sense a disturbing aura about her. There was something unsettling in the way she stood, almost as if she were swaying slightly, and the faintest hint of a smile played on her lips. My first instinct was to ignore her. After all, my parents had always drilled into me the importance of not opening the door to strangers, especially when I was home alone. But something held me back. Perhaps it was the woman's apparent frailty, or maybe it was the desperation in her posture that tugged at my conscience. Taking a deep breath to steady my nerves, I cautiously unlatched the door and pulled it open a crack. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The woman looked up, and I gasped. Her face was pale and gaunt, etched with wrinkles that seemed to speak of a lifetime of hardship. Her eyes, though, were what truly unnerved me. They were large and dark, burning with an unnatural intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. They seemed to bore into me, seeing right through my facade of bravery. "Dear," she rasped, her voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "I seem to have lost my way. Could I trouble you for the use of your telephone? My car. It's broken down, and I need to call for help." I hesitated. Something about her didn't feel right, but the storm was raging outside, and she looked so vulnerable. Sure," I mumbled, stepping aside to let her in. As she shuffled past me, a musty odor, like damp earth and decaying flowers, filled the air. I closed the door behind her, my unease growing with every step she took. I led her into the living room, my apprehension growing with every step. The woman moved with a strange, unsettling fluidity, her joints popping softly with each movement. I gestured towards the phone on the coffee table, trying to maintain a safe distance. "Thank you, dear," she said, her voice a raspy whisper that seemed to slither through the air. She picked up the receiver, her long, bony fingers wrapping around it like claws. I watched as she dialed a number, her lips moving silently as she waited for the call to connect. The woman's presence seemed to weigh heavily on the room. The shadows seemed to deepen, and a chill crept into the air, despite the warmth from the fireplace. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if I were being watched. I tried to focus on the movie playing on the television, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. The woman's strange whispers filled the room, her words a jumble of disconnected phrases and unsettling pronouncements. "They'll be coming soon," she muttered, her eyes fixed on some unseen point in the distance. "They'll be hungry." I shifted uncomfortably, my heart pounding in my chest. Who was she talking about? And what did she mean by hungry? Suddenly, she turned her head, her dark eyes locking onto mine. A jolt of fear shot through me, and I instinctively took a step back. Her gaze was intense, predatory, like a hawk eyeing its prey. "You have such kind eyes, dear," she said, a chilling smile spreading across her lips. "Such beautiful, innocent eyes." Her words sent a wave of revulsion through me. I wanted to scream, to run, to escape the suffocating presence of this strange woman. But my feet felt rooted to the spot, frozen by fear. The woman continued to stare at me, her smile widening, revealing a set of yellowed teeth. I felt a growing sense of dread, a certainty that something terrible was about to happen. Just then, a loud crack echoed through the house, followed by the distinct sound of shattering glass. I jumped, my eyes darting around the room, searching for the source of the noise. "What was that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The woman's smile vanished, replaced by a look of annoyance. "Nothing, dear," she said dismissively. "Just a little accident." But I knew it was more than that. I could feel a malevolent presence in the house, a darkness that seemed to be closing in on me. My instincts screamed at me to get away from this woman, to get out of the house. But before I could act, she rose from the couch, her eyes gleaming with an unholy light. "It's time, dear," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "Time to pay the price." Panic surged through me, an icy wave that threatened to drown me in fear. I scrambled backwards, my eyes wide with terror. The woman advanced, her movements no longer slow and unsteady but swift and predatory, like a striking cobra. "No!" I screamed, my voice raw with fear. "Stay away from me." I turned and fled, my bare feet pounding on the hardwood floor. I raced down the hallway, my lungs burning, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. The woman's chilling laughter echoed behind me, spurring me on. I burst through the living room, narrowly avoiding a vase that crashed to the floor, shattering into a million pieces. The sound of the breaking glass seemed to fuel the woman's rage, and her laughter grew louder, more maniacal. I scrambled up the stairs, taking them two at a time. I could hear the woman's footsteps close behind me, her ragged breathing heavy in the air. My hand fumbled with the doorknob to my bedroom, and I stumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I fumbled for the lock, my fingers trembling, and finally managed to secure it. I leaned against the door, gasping for breath, my body shaking uncontrollably. The woman pounded on the door, her voice a guttural growl. "Let me in, dear," she snarled. "It's no use hiding. You can't escape your fate." I pressed my ear against the door, listening to her frantic pounding and crazed ramblings. Fear threatened to consume me, but I forced myself to think. I had to get help. My eyes darted around the room, searching for a way out. The window. I could climb out the window and escape. I raced to the window, throwing it open, but as I peered out, my heart sank. My bedroom was on the second floor, and the drop to the ground was too far. I couldn't jump. Desperation clawed at me. I was trapped. Then I remembered my phone. I scrambled back to my bed, grabbing my phone from the nightstand. My fingers flew across the screen as I dialed 911. The line connected, and a calm voice answered. 911. What's your emergency? Help. I gasped, my voice choked with sobs. There's a woman in my house. She's trying to hurt me. Okay, stay calm, the operator said soothingly. Can you tell me your address? I rattled off my address, my voice trembling. And your name? It's Sarah, I stammered. All right, Sarah, the operator said. We're sending help right now. Just stay on the line with me, okay? I clung to the phone like a lifeline, the operator's calm voice a beacon of hope in the darkness. Suddenly, the pounding on the door stopped. An eerie silence descended upon the house, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. Sarah? The operator's voice came through the phone. Are you still there? Yes, I whispered, my eyes darting nervously around the room. But she's stopped. I don't hear her anymore. Okay, just stay put, the operator said. The police are on their way. But even as the operator spoke, a new sound reached my ears, a sound that sent a fresh wave of terror washing over me. It was a slow, deliberate scratching sound coming from the other side of the door. Someone was trying to unlock it. My blood ran cold. I clutched the phone tighter, my knuckles turning white. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. Sarah, the operator's voice said, a hint of urgency in her tone. What's happening? She's trying to get in, I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. She's picking the lock. Okay, Sarah, listen to me, the operator said, her voice firm. Find something you can use to defend yourself. Anything. A lamp, a book, anything. My eyes frantically scanned the room, searching for a potential weapon. I spotted a heavy glass vase on my dresser. I grabbed it, my hand trembling. The scratching at the door grew louder, more frantic. I could hear the lock clicking, the mechanism slowly giving way. Sarah, what's your situation? The operator asked, her voice tense. She's almost through. The door burst open, and the woman lunged into the room, her eyes blazing with fury. I screamed, raising the vase above my head. The woman lunged at me, her arms outstretched. I swung the vase with all my might, bringing it crashing down on her head. The woman staggered back, a look of surprise on her face. Blood trickled from a gash on her forehead, but she didn't cry out. She just stared at me, her eyes filled with a cold, malevolent rage. I raised the vase again, ready to strike. But before I could, a powerful force slammed into me, knocking me off my feet. I landed hard on the floor, the vase slipping from my grasp. I looked up, my heart pounding in my chest. Standing over me was the woman, her face contorted in a snarl. She raised her hand, her long, bony fingers reaching for my throat. Now, dear, she hissed, her voice like the hiss of a serpent. It's time to die. I closed my eyes, bracing for the inevitable. But instead of pain, I heard a commotion from downstairs, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps pounding up the stairs. Sarah, a man's voice boomed. Sarah, where are you? I opened my eyes, a flicker of hope igniting in my chest. It was the police. The woman froze, her eyes darting nervously towards the door. She hesitated for a moment, then turned and fled, disappearing into the darkness of the hallway. Sarah, the policeman shouted again. Are you okay? I'm here. I cried, scrambling to my feet. I'm in here. The policeman burst into the room, his gun drawn. He looked around, his eyes taking in the scene. The broken door, the blood on the floor, the terrified girl clutching her phone. Are you hurt? He asked, his voice gruff but concerned. I don't think so, I stammered, my voice shaking. But the woman, I trailed off, unable to find the words to describe the horror I had just experienced. The policeman holstered his gun and knelt beside me, his expression softening. It's okay, Sarah, he said gently. You're safe now. We're going to take care of you. He helped me to my feet, and I clung to him, my body still trembling with fear. The other policemen searched the house, but the woman was gone. They found no trace of her, no sign of forced entry. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. I was taken to the hospital to be checked over, but I was physically unharmed. The doctors said I was just shaken up, and they sent me home with my parents. But the trauma of that night lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched, hunted. I couldn't sleep, haunted by nightmares of the old woman and her chilling laughter. The police investigated, but they found no leads. They couldn't identify the woman, and they had no explanation for her sudden appearance and disappearance. The case went cold, and the mystery of the old woman remained unsolved. The following days were a blur. The police investigation turned up nothing. No fingerprints that didn't belong to my family, no signs of forced entry, no witnesses. The old woman, like a phantom, had vanished without a trace. My parents, initially relieved at my physical safety, grew increasingly concerned about my mental state. Nightmares plagued my sleep, filled with the woman's chilling laughter and the relentless scratching at my bedroom door. I jumped at every creak of the house. Every shadow seemed to hold the thread of the old woman's return. Therapy helped, to an extent. I learned coping mechanisms, strategies to manage the anxiety and fear that still clung to me like a shroud. But the questions lingered. Who was that woman? What did she want? Why me? Theories swirled in my mind, each more unsettling than the last. Was she a ghost, a vengeful spirit seeking retribution for some long-forgotten wrong? Was she a deranged individual preying on vulnerable young women? Or was there something more sinister at play? Something supernatural that defied rational explanation? One afternoon, while researching local legends and folklore for a school project, I stumbled upon a chilling tale. It spoke of a woman, known as the Night Hag, who roamed the countryside, preying on those who were alone and vulnerable. She was said to be a harbinger of misfortune, a bringer of death. The description sent chills down my spine. Could this be the woman who had terrorized me? Could the Night Hag be real? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I closed the book, a sense of dread settling over me. Was it just a coincidence? Or was there something more to the legend? Weeks turned into months, and the fear gradually subsided, replaced by a lingering sense of unease. I continued to look over my shoulder, to scan every crowd for a glimpse of the old woman's haunting eyes. The incident left an indelible mark on me. I was no longer the carefree girl I had been before that night. I was more cautious, more aware of the darkness that lurked in the shadows. But it also awakened something within me, a strength and resilience I never knew I possessed. I had faced my fears, and I had survived. And while the mystery of the old woman remained unsolved, I knew that I would never be truly free from the shadow of that night. The highway stretched out before us, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the heart of the Nevada desert. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a sky stained with streaks of orange and purple. It had been a fantastic weekend getaway in Vegas with my best friend, Emily. We were both exhausted but buzzing from the whirlwind of shows, casinos, and late-night adventures. Now, with the city lights fading in the rearview mirror, a sense of calm settled over me. I glanced over at Emily, who was humming along to the radio, her head bobbing slightly. She caught my eye and grinned. Best trip ever, right? Absolutely, I replied, returning her smile. We needed this. We fell into a comfortable silence, the only sounds the gentle hum of the engine and the occasional passing truck. As the darkness deepened, however, the landscape outside the windows became increasingly desolate. The vast expanse of desert seemed to stretch on forever, punctuated only by the occasional scrubby bush or distant rock formation. A shiver ran down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I tried to dismiss the feeling as paranoia, but it lingered. I found myself checking the rearview mirror more frequently, scanning the road behind us for any sign of another vehicle. It was then that I noticed it, a large, black pickup truck, looming in the distance. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, we were in the middle of nowhere, and it wasn't unusual to see a truck on the highway. But as the minutes ticked by, the truck remained in my rearview mirror, growing steadily larger. It was as if it was glued to us, matching our speed with unnerving precision. I felt a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. "Hey, I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Do you see that truck behind us?" Emily craned her neck to look. "Yeah, what about it?" "It's been back there for a while now. It's kind of freaking me out." Emily shrugged. "Probably just some trucker heading home. Don't worry about it." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The truck was too close, too persistent, and there was something about its appearance that set my teeth on edge. It was old and beat up, with rust eating away at its edges. The windows were tinted dark, obscuring the driver inside. No identifying marks, no company logo, just a hulking mass of black metal. I pressed my foot down on the gas pedal, increasing our speed. The truck responded instantly, accelerating along with us. My heart pounded in my chest. "Okay, this is officially weird," I muttered. Emily finally seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation. "Okay, yeah, that's not normal," she said, her voice tight with apprehension. "What do we do?" My mind raced. We were miles from the nearest town, with nothing but endless desert surrounding us. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. "But we can't just keep driving like this. We need to lose it." Spotting an exit sign approaching, I made a split-second decision. "Hold on," I yelled, yanking the steering wheel hard to the right. The car screeched as we veered off the highway, tires spitting gravel as we careened down the exit ramp. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The truck had followed us, its headlights bearing down on us like the eyes of a predator. A wave of fear washed over me, cold and suffocating. The exit ramp led to a narrow, two-lane road that snaked through the barren landscape. I pushed the car harder, the engine roaring in protest as I navigated the twists and turns. But the truck remained hot on our tail, its presence a constant, menacing shadow. "It's still there," Emily cried, her voice filled with panic. "It's not giving up." We were trapped in a terrifying game of cat and mouse, the desolate highway our twisted playground. Every time I thought we might have shaken it, the truck would reappear, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a malevolent grin. I tried everything I could think of to lose it. I took random turns, doubled back, even drove in circles. But the truck was relentless, anticipating our every move. It was as if it knew the roads better than we did, as if it was being guided by some unseen force. With each passing mile, our hope dwindled. The landscape seemed to close in on us, the darkness pressing down like a suffocating blanket. The only sounds were the pounding of our hearts and the relentless rumble of the truck's engine. Suddenly, Emily gasped. "Look!" she shouted, pointing to a sign in the distance. "A town. Maybe there's a police station." A surge of adrenaline coursed through me. It was a long shot, but it was our only hope. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and floored the gas pedal, urging the car forward. The town, a cluster of lights shimmering in the distance, grew larger with every passing second. Hope surged through me, a lifeline in the overwhelming sea of fear. We might actually make it. As we raced towards the town, I scanned the road ahead, desperately searching for any sign of a police station. Finally, I saw it, a small, brick building with a blue and red flashing light perched on its roof. "There!" I shouted, pointing towards the building. "The police station." Relief washed over me as I pulled the car into the parking lot and slammed on the brakes. We tumbled out of the car, our legs shaky, our breath coming in ragged gasps. "We're safe now," I said to Emily, trying to reassure myself as much as her. But even as I spoke the words, a chill ran down my spine. Something felt wrong. We turned to look back at the road, expecting to see the truck's headlights appear at any moment. But there was nothing. The road was completely deserted. The truck had vanished. "Where did it go?" Emily whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. I shook my head, unable to comprehend what had just happened. 1 minute it was right behind us, and the next it was gone. It was as if it had simply dissolved into thin air. We hurried towards the police station, our hearts still pounding. A lone officer sat behind the desk, looking bored. We stumbled through our story, recounting the terrifying ordeal we had just endured. The officer listened patiently, but his expression remained skeptical. He asked us for a description of the truck and the driver, but we could offer little information. The windows had been too dark to see inside, and in the darkness and panic, we hadn't been able to make out any identifying details. He sighed and shook his head. "I'm sorry, ladies, but without more information, there's not much I can do." "You said you didn't get a license plate number?" We shook our heads, defeated. "Well, if you remember anything else, or if it happens again, don't hesitate to call us," the officer said, his tone dismissive. We left the police station feeling deflated and vulnerable. The officer's lack of concern left us feeling as if we had imagined the whole thing. But we knew what we had seen. We knew we had been followed, chased, terrorized. As we got back in the car, the fear returned, sharper than ever. We were alone, stranded in a strange town, with no one to believe our story. And somewhere out there, in the vast darkness of the desert night, the black truck was waiting. The desert stretched out on either side of Route 66, an endless expanse of sand and scrub brush bathed in the pale glow of the moon. It was well past midnight, and the only sound was the low hum of my car's engine as I drove through the desolate landscape. I was heading back to Flagstaff after a weekend trip to visit my brother in Albuquerque, and exhaustion was starting to gnaw at the edges of my awareness. Every few miles, I'd glance at the clock on the dashboard, willing the minutes to pass faster. I had been driving for hours, and the monotony of the highway was starting to get to me. The occasional truck would rumble past, momentarily breaking the silence, but otherwise, I was utterly alone. I was beginning to regret my decision to drive through the night. It had seemed like a good idea at the time, a way to save some time and get back home sooner. But now, with the darkness pressing in on all sides and the miles stretching out endlessly before me, I was starting to feel a sense of unease. Suddenly, I saw a figure standing on the side of the road, a woman waving her arms. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. It was late, and this stretch of highway was known for being deserted. A flicker of apprehension, a primal instinct warning me of danger, pulsed through me. But then, I thought of how vulnerable she looked standing there alone, and a wave of compassion washed over me. I couldn't just leave her stranded. I pulled over to the side of the road, and the woman hurried towards my car. As she got closer, I could see that she was young, maybe in her early 20s, with long dark hair and pale skin. She was wearing a simple white dress that seemed out of place in this desolate landscape. Thank you so much for stopping," she said, her voice breathless and laced with a hint of desperation. "I've been walking for hours. Could you please give me a ride to the next town?" "Sure, no problem," I replied, trying to sound reassuring. "Hop in." She slid into the passenger seat, and I pulled back onto the highway. As we drove, I stole a glance at her. There was something about her that I couldn't quite put my finger on, something unsettling. Her eyes, dark and deep-set, seemed to hold a strange intensity, and there was a nervous energy about her that made me uncomfortable. "What's your name?" I asked, trying to make conversation. "Maria," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you again for giving me a ride. You're a lifesaver." "Don't mention it," I said. "It's no trouble at all." We drove in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional sigh from Maria. I tried to focus on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Maria's presence seemed to fill the car, an almost palpable weight that pressed down on me. The air in the car grew heavy, charged with a strange energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Maria shifted in her seat, her gaze darting around the interior of the car, her fingers nervously twisting a lock of her hair. "It's getting cold," she said suddenly, her voice taking on a strange, high-pitched quality. I glanced at the temperature gauge on the dashboard. It read a steady 70 degrees. "I don't think so," I replied, trying to keep my voice even. "It seems fine to me." "No, it's cold," she insisted, her voice growing louder. "Can't you feel it? It's freezing." I felt a shiver run down my spine. Despite the warmth of the car, Maria's words seemed to hang in the air, a chilling dissonance against the otherwise unremarkable night. I tried to dismiss it as her just being cold, but there was an edge to her voice, a frantic insistence that made me uneasy. Then, she started to talk, rambling about things that made no sense. She spoke of shadows that whispered secrets, of a town lost in time, and of a love betrayed. Her words were disjointed, fragmented, like pieces of a shattered mirror reflecting distorted images of a forgotten past. I tried to follow what she was saying, but her words seemed to slip through my grasp, leaving me with a growing sense of dread. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed on me with an intensity that made me want to shrink back in my seat. It felt like she was peering into my soul, seeing things that I didn't want to be seen. A wave of fear washed over me, cold and suffocating. I had to get her out of the car. I had to get away from her. "I think I need to stop for a bit," I said, my voice trembling. "I need to stretch my legs." I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the gear stick. Maria didn't move. She just sat there, staring at me, a strange smile playing on her lips. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice a chilling whisper. "Don't you want to help me anymore?" I just need some air," I stammered, my heart pounding in my chest. I got out of the car, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere within. I leaned against the hood, taking deep breaths of the cool night air, trying to calm my racing heart. But the respite was short-lived. Maria's voice, sharp and insistent, cut through the night. "Get back in the car," she commanded. "We need to go." I hesitated, my fear warring with a strange sense of obligation. I knew I should leave, drive away as fast as I could, but something held me back. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Where do we need to go?" "It doesn't matter," she replied, her voice laced with impatience. "Just get in the car." Her words held a strange power, a hypnotic pull that I couldn't resist. I glanced back at the car, the interior shrouded in darkness, Maria's silhouette a menacing shadow against the dim light of the dashboard. Reluctantly, I opened the car door and slid back into the driver's seat. Maria's eyes were fixed on me, burning with an eerie intensity. "Drive," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. I put the car in gear and pulled back onto the highway. The silence in the car was oppressive, broken only by the hum of the engine and the sound of my own ragged breathing. Maria's gaze remained fixed on me, her eyes boring into me like twin lasers. I tried to avoid her gaze, focusing on the road ahead, but her presence was overwhelming, a suffocating weight that pressed down on me. Suddenly, Maria let out a piercing scream, a sound that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the night. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. "What is it?" I shouted, my heart pounding in my chest. Maria was shaking uncontrollably, her body racked with sobs. "They're coming," she wailed, her voice filled with terror. "They're coming to get me." "Who's coming?" I asked, my voice trembling. "The shadows," she cried. "They're everywhere. They're going to take me back." I looked around, but there was nothing there. The highway stretched out before us, empty and desolate. "There's no one here, Maria," I said, trying to calm her. "It's just us." But she wouldn't listen. She continued to scream and cry, her body convulsing with fear. I reached out to touch her, to comfort her, but she recoiled as if I had burned her. "Don't touch me," she shrieked. "You can't help me. No one can." Her words were filled with despair, a chilling acceptance of an inevitable fate. I felt a surge of pity for her, this terrified woman trapped in the grip of some unseen horror. Then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped. Maria's screams subsided. Her body went limp, and her head slumped against the headrest. She was still, eerily still. I reached out tentatively and touched her arm. It was cold, icy cold. A wave of fear washed over me, and I recoiled as if I had been struck. I looked at her face, bathed in the pale moonlight. Her eyes were closed, her expression peaceful, almost serene. But there was something about her, something in the stillness of her features that sent a shiver down my spine. It was then that I noticed it. Her skin was pale, translucent, almost glowing in the darkness, and her eyes, even though they were closed, seemed to be staring at me, accusingly. A horrifying realization dawned on me. Maria was dead. She had been dead all along. Panic surged through me, a tidal wave of fear that threatened to overwhelm me. I scrambled out of the car, stumbling onto the asphalt, my legs shaking uncontrollably. I needed to get away from her, from this car, from this desolate stretch of highway. But where could I go? I was miles from the nearest town, stranded in the middle of nowhere with a dead woman in my passenger seat. I glanced back at the car, the interior now bathed in an eerie green light emanating from Maria's body. The sight sent a fresh wave of terror through me, and I turned and ran, fleeing into the darkness, the sound of my own ragged breathing echoing in my ears. I ran until I could run no more, my lungs burning, my legs aching. I collapsed by the side of the road, gasping for breath, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion. As I lay there, my mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. Who was Maria? What was she? And why had she chosen me? Then, a memory surfaced, a fragment of a conversation I had overheard at a gas station earlier that day. Two old men, their faces weathered and worn, were talking about a local legend, a ghost story about a young woman who had been murdered on this very stretch of highway many years ago. They said that her ghost still haunted the road, searching for someone to help her find peace. Could it be? Could Maria be the ghost that the old men had been talking about? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I looked back at the car, the green light still glowing in the darkness. I had to get away from here, from this cursed place. I struggled to my feet and started walking, stumbling along the highway, my eyes fixed on the horizon. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay here. After what felt like an eternity, I saw lights in the distance. A town, a beacon of hope in the vast emptiness of the desert. I picked up my pace, my heart filled with a desperate hope. I reached the town just as the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon. I stumbled into a diner, my clothes torn, my face streaked with dirt and sweat. The waitress, a kind-hearted woman with a warm smile, took one look at me and knew that something was wrong. I told her everything that had happened, my voice trembling with fear and exhaustion. She listened patiently, her eyes filled with concern. When I had finished my story, she told me about Maria. She had been a young woman, just married, on her way to start a new life with her husband in California. But their car had broken down on this desolate stretch of highway, and they had been forced to walk for help. A truck driver, drunk and reckless, had hit them, killing them both. Maria's husband had been buried in the local cemetery, but Maria's body had never been found. Her ghost, they said, still wandered the highway, searching for her lost love. The waitress's words confirmed my worst fears. Maria was a ghost, a restless spirit trapped in a perpetual cycle of searching and sorrow. I stayed in the town for a few days, recovering from my ordeal. The locals were kind and welcoming, and they did their best to comfort me. But the memory of that night, the chilling encounter with Maria, haunted my dreams. I eventually returned home, but I was a changed man. The experience had shaken me to my core, leaving me with a profound sense of unease and a deep-seated fear of the unknown. I never drove on that stretch of highway again, and whenever I saw a hitchhiker on the side of the road, I remembered Maria, the ghost of Route 66, and I kept on driving, Sometimes, late at night, when the wind is howling and the shadows are long, I think I hear her voice, a faint whisper on the edge of hearing, calling my name. And I wonder if Maria is still out there, wandering the highway, searching for someone to help her find peace. Thank you for joining me tonight on the Rainy Night Storyteller. If these stories sent a chill down your spine, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more haunting tales under the rain. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, sometimes the scariest things aren't in the stories we tell, but in the shadows we don't see. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep tonight.